You ever notice how when you're driving, the trees right by the road are just a blur, but the mountains way off in the distance barely seem to move at all? Well, that simple little observation, that's the key to everything we're talking about today. It's a concept that helps us measure the stars, understand the conflicts raging inside our own minds, and believe it or not, can even be used as a psychological weapon.
See, that effect, it's called parallax. And it's not just about physical distance. It's about how any shift in your point of view, whether it's physical, psychological, or even societal, completely changes what you see as reality. So, how in the world does a tool for astronomy become a tool for manipulation? Well, stick around, because that is exactly what we're going to break down. Here's the roadmap. We're going to start with the simple science, what parallax actually is. Then we'll take that idea and see how it works inside our own heads. From there, we'll zoom out to see it on a massive societal scale, look at how it can be exploited in some pretty scary ways, and then finally, talk about how to find our way back to a more whole and balanced perspective. All right, first things first. What is the so-called trick of the eye?
Okay, the key word here, the one you really got to focus on, is apparent. The thing you're looking at isn't moving at all. You are. Your position as the observer is what changes, and that creates this illusion of movement. It is all about your point of view.
In fact, you can try this right now. Go on, hold your thumb out in front of your face. Now close your left eye, and then switch to your right. See that? See how your thumb seems to jump back and forth against the wall? That's parallax in action. And what's really cool is if you move your thumb farther away and do it again, the jump is way smaller. The closer an object is, the bigger its parallax shift. And astronomers, they do the exact same thing, but on a cosmic scale. They use the Earth's entire orbit as a gigantic baseline. So they'll measure a star's position in, say, January, then they wait 6 months for the Earth to travel all the way to the other side of the sun, and they measure it again in July. That tiny, tiny apparent shift against the backdrop of super distant galaxies lets them calculate how far away that star is with mind-blowing accuracy. So the main takeaway here is really simple. Parallax isn't about seeing just one thing. It's about the deeper truth you can only discover when you have two different perspectives.
But what happens when those different lines of sight aren't your left and right eye, or the Earth in summer and winter? What if they're different psychological states, different ways of thinking?
And this is where we jump from the stars right into the human mind. Because just like we have two physical eyes, our psyche has two fundamental and often clashing points of view. You know, the great psychologist Carl Jung saw this perfectly when he looked at the work of Freud and Adler. Here you have two absolute geniuses looking at the exact same human problems, but they came to totally different conclusions. Freud saw everything through the lens of repressed desires, while Adler saw it all as a struggle for power. Jung realized they weren't necessarily wrong, they were just incomplete. They were each looking from a different psychological vantage point, creating their own kind of parallax. And this brings us to the parallax happening inside every single one of us. We have our conscious mind, that's our ego, the part we think of as me, our rational thoughts. But then there's the unconscious, this huge hidden world that holds everything we've pushed away or ignored. And it offers a completely different, often totally opposite take on our lives. Jung actually had a name for this hidden perspective. He called it the shadow. It's all the parts of ourselves we'd rather not admit exist. And just like closing one eye doesn't make your thumb vanish, ignoring your shadow doesn't make it go away. In fact, it does the opposite. It creates this constant internal friction, this state of being at war with yourself that we call neurosis. So if that's what happens inside one person, what happens when this scales up to an entire society? What happens when a whole culture basically decides to look at the world with only one eye shut? Well, you get what we can call societal parallax. It's a massive, collective blind spot. It happens when one single way of seeing the world, one ideology, one set of rules, gets so powerful that it crushes or ridicules all other viewpoints. The entire society ends up with a warped perception of reality. The real danger here is the tyranny of the number one, this absolute insistence on a single, rigid way of being. Because when a society pushes everything it doesn't like into its collective shadow, those repressed ideas and instincts, they don't just vanish. They fester in the dark. And this societal blind spot, this deliberately manufactured parallax error, well, this is where it gets scary. Because it can absolutely be weaponized. It can be used to control entire populations and bring down governments. The playbook is chillingly effective. First, you hammer home one single, dominant story, over and over again. Then, you silence anyone who disagrees. You censor them, you mock them, you call them irrational. Next, you tap into that collective shadow, all those repressed fears and hatreds, and you aim them like a weapon. And finally, you demand conformity, because an individual with their own point of view is the greatest enemy to a single story. And you can see how this becomes a war on two fronts. To control the citizens, you create what Jung called psychic inflation. You make people feel like they're part of some special, chosen group, which makes them intolerant of outsiders. And to attack a government, you find its blind spot, the gap between what it says and what it does, and you expose it. Then you trigger a fundamental law of the psyche, enantidromia. That's a fancy word for the idea that any extreme will eventually swing back into its violent opposite. You're basically lighting a fuse to make the whole system tear itself apart.
So, is there a way out of this? How do we fix our own parallax errors and protect ourselves from this kind of manipulation? Well, the answer lies in learning how to see with both eyes open at the same time.
Jung had a name for the solution too. He called it the transcendent function. It's this amazing, natural process that happens when you're brave enough to hold the tension between two opposites, your conscious self and your shadow self. It's not about one side winning. It's about building a bridge between them. It's the psychological version of using parallax, not as a mistake, but as a tool to find your true, stable position.
And really, that's what this is all about. True wholeness, for a person or for a society, doesn't come from the rational mind crushing the irrational. It comes from the courage to acknowledge both viewpoints, to sit in the discomfort of that conflict, and to allow a new, stronger, and more complete reality to be born from that tension.
Which really just leaves one final question for you to think about. If every single perspective we hold creates its own parallax, its own version of reality based on a single position, what hidden truths, what parts of your own shadow, what entire dimensions of reality are being hidden from you simply because of the way you've chosen to look at the world?